Right, ladies and gentlemen, when it's Tuesday, it's the role leadership talks. We are glad today to be here with you, able to engage with you, learn, and move ourselves to the next level. Where are you tuning in from? Continue with Dr. Paul discussing matters leadership. And the role leadership talk keeps it raw. And we discuss things as they are. You can tune in on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and also the YouTube channel. Tune in on my YouTube channel. Subscribe and go to learn what to learn. For a moment, before we begin the discussion, where are you watching us from? We'd like to know from you. Thank you very much. Dr. Paul, how have you been?
I'm winning. I'm great, my brother. I'm fantastic. I wonder how you're doing.
I am well. I thank God. My week has been good since Tuesday when we were on this show discussing about inclusive leadership. Something that cannot be ignored by organization in this post-COVID era. And just to do a recap, Dr. Paul, about inclusive leadership, what is it and why it is important to have inclusive leadership in an organization? Just to keep our audience, especially those who maybe are joining us today and they were never there last week, just to help them understand where we are coming from, where we are, and where we're going to be going today.
Sure, that's great. And we said that inclusive leadership is the ability to manage and to lead a heterogeneous group of people so that they can work effectively and efficiently, whilst at the same time recognizing their uniqueness. And we said that each individual brings in their talents and their giftings into the organization, irrespective of their background, irrespective of their education status, irrespective of their ethnic groupings, nationality, and all those other things that we use in our modern day society to divide people according to things and classes. And we said this form of leadership creates an environment where people are appreciated for the value that they bring into an organization or they bring into a network that they belong to. And inclusive leaders are individuals who are able to recognize that uniqueness in each person's capabilities, and they are able to harness that uniqueness by creating a conducive environment, which we referred to as psychological safety. And we said that when people feel psychologically safe in any environment, there are certain things that do happen immediately in their lives. And those are the things we relabeled as importance of inclusive leadership. So one thing we said that happens is that it unleashes people's potential and creativity. When people feel safe and included in an environment and that whatever they do is appreciated and honored, they're able to dream more. They're able to do more beyond the call of duty. The second thing we said why this inclusive leadership is important is that we recognize that there is no one person who is the epitome of wisdom. We have to recognize that everybody who participates in any organization, in any place, they carry those innate talents and giftings. And the task of leadership is to create an environment where those talents and possibilities can find expression. And when they find expression, they collectively raise the value of the organization or the work that they do in that organization. And thirdly, we said it's the only way to make leadership possible in this post-COVID-19 era. A leadership that does not appreciate that there is more than what you see in an individual, then it means already that organization has decided to be static and stagnant to an extent that its death is just on the horizon. Organizations that are thriving and are winning are those organizations that appreciate that people bring in uniqueness into their environment, and that uniqueness must be given an opportunity to find expression. Those are the ones who make things happen. And as we said, lastly, is that everything rises and falls on leadership, just as our mentor, Dr. John C. Maxwell says. So if it doesn't begin with the leadership, then forget about thriving and winning in such an organization.
Wonderful thoughts there. And I believe those who are joining us for the first time today and they were never there last week, we'll encourage you to go and subscribe to my channel and watch that video, the recordings of last week when we began this series. And we're going to be here for the whole month on inclusive leadership. And I believe you and your team, you can mobilize each other, watch these things together and see how do you make inclusive leadership work in your organization. But Dr. Paul, looking at today's topic, what are the barriers to inclusive leadership? What are the barriers to inclusive leadership?
That's a very important question to reflect on, because whilst we want to look at the positive side of inclusive leadership and what it entails, inclusive leadership is a serious responsibility on the part of the leaders. And if they're not able to drive inclusive leadership as a process, then the barriers that we're going to highlight shortly can become an impediment to the vision that they anticipate to have in their own organization. So the first barrier is what I call attitudinal barrier. When people have attitudes towards people that are not positive, they are not nurturing attitudes, where people have this latent negative vibe towards individuals within the organization or within the network, that creates a situation that impedes inclusive leadership. It creates some kind of barriers, including psychological barriers. When people do not see each other beyond the race, or beyond the color of their skin, or beyond their religion, or beyond their ethnicity, already those barriers exist in people's subconscious. And therefore, in that kind of an environment, you inhibit inclusive leadership, because already there is something that it makes, there's already like a hurdle to be crossed before I reach to the other person psychologically. So the second barrier is the physical barriers. One of the things that organizations are doing now, even more and more, I don't know whether you've seen that in Kenya, but at least in South Africa, in Durban, where I am, I'm seeing that is where now organizations are creating open spaces for working. No longer people working in small offices where you can't even know your neighbor, because you only come straight into your office, you don't know who is next. So what's happening now, the barriers are being removed, and people are working in an open space. You can literally see somebody coming in, and you can be able to see them going on. You can interact with them without having to go through a door. And those spaces are being created so that there will be more interaction amongst staff, and there is more information sharing. At the same time, it's breaking away any barriers, including psychological barriers, because offices, for example, have a way of creating barriers in people's minds. People become so desensitized about a person's next door, because there is nothing really to connect about. I just come into your office and you come into your office, we do what we do, and at the end of the day, everybody goes home. But when we create these open spaces, you can hardly ignore a person. You will definitely have to see me, and I have to definitely see you. And when we see each other, we will talk. And so that's one way organizations are reforming their architectures within organizations to create inclusive spaces, so that they can promote that oneness that needs to to connect with each other. The other barrier that can really inhibit inclusive leadership is poor communication. As we said last week, communication is a very important factor in enabling inclusive leadership, because if information has to be received, there has to be two-way process. The one who's communicating and the one who is intended to receive that information must understand the message. And so communication only happens when the receiver of the information understands what the sender of the information intended to do. And so the way it impacts inclusive leadership is that if leadership does not communicate effectively, the outcome is always not as expected, because the receiver of the information did not receive and interpret the information as it was sent by the sender. So communication can become a very serious barrier to inclusive leadership, where people now start in an organization, starting working from assumption. I assumed you said, or I
Yes.
thought you said, but that's not
Mhm.
what I intended you to do. So communication, if it's not handled properly within an organization, can become a very big barrier to inclusive leadership. And the other aspect that becomes a barrier is when there is lack of clarity about roles and responsibilities of individuals. Again, this
Yes.
is a huge one, because when people don't know what they are supposed to be doing, they get confused. And when they get confused, they start trampling on what people call in organizations, trampling on each other's toes. Because when I
Yes.
don't know exactly what you're doing and you don't know what I'm exactly doing, there is an overlap of what we do. And because their environment is not psychologically safe, then
Mhm.
the people stand to get back to their default positions, and default positions in this case become like anger producing positions. So
Mhm.
somebody sitting with something that is festering because they're not able to openly talk about what they see and what they're experiencing. Meanwhile,
Mhm.
in their minds, they start disconnecting themselves from the organization or from people. Over
Mhm.
time, their efforts are affected, the productivity is affected, the innovation is affected, and one thing always leads to the next, until to the extent where now perhaps people even leave organization. Dr. Maxwell says people do not leave organizations, people leave people.
People leave people. Now, a powerful goal. The people actually don't leave organization. When people
Yes,
leave, it's because there's somebody in the organization that doesn't make them comfortable, and so they
exactly.
decide they want to leave this person.
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
And that's the danger. When people get to that point, you might lose your best talent because
Mhm.
it was not properly managed, or the environment was not conducive to harness the relationship to an extent that individual talent can be manifested and can even add value to the business or to the
Mhm.
entity. And so when lack of clarity, or what I would call ambiguity in terms of roles and responsibilities, can become a serious impediment to
Mhm.
creating inclusive environment where people feel valued, acknowledged, and they are respected.
Wonderful thoughts, wonderful thought. Dan Dante says, following. Thank you very much, Dan, for tuning in. Wonderful thoughts there from Dr. Paul on the barriers and how leaders can actually overcome those barriers. We're going to get to that, but we are looking at barriers to inclusive leadership. And how then do leaders overcome these barriers? Because there seem to be so many barriers, especially in our continent of Africa.
Mhm.
Uh, we are all black, but most of the time we are not very inclusive. I don't know. We have so many small things, and I usually say these small things hinder people from going into great things and seeing the
Exactly.
big picture. And
Yeah,
Bernard is following us also from Mombasa. Thank you very much. How then do leaders overcome these barriers? Because they can actually set a whole organization on fire
exactly.
in a negative way because
Yes,
of unconsciously or consciously allowing these barriers to be in operation.
that's very true. In fact, one of the other barriers I should have mentioned there in the category was what I would call static leadership. In other
Mhm.
words, this is leadership that is not willing to transform with times and become relevant to the organizations they lead, and even to the entities that, or group of people that they actually lead. And so when a static leadership is in place, you can imagine all kinds of barriers to that kind of leadership that they will create through their own persona, for example, and two, through their own policies that they'll put in there. As we said last week, one of the dangers of leaders in such times like post-COVID-19 times is
Mhm.
leadership that would use policies to stifle growth. And
Yeah.
because of the enormity power that they have as leaders of organization, they have a privilege of creating systems and policies that can make sure that there is nobody threatens their status quo. So what happens in static leadership, it is not amenable to ideas. It's not amenable to alternative ways of seeing things. It is also not open to new innovative ways that can challenge, the comfort zones. We've always done this way, therefore it remains this way. Because what post-pandemic leadership requires is to constantly explore opportunities that can make you thrive and do better than yesterday. And that means you cannot have change and comfort at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah, those two do not coexist. You must have some level of discomfort to create the change you want to see. And so static leadership is always very careful and cautious because it likes to feel safe. It tries to live to, it doesn't like this discomfort of anything. And so it becomes a barrier. And so overcoming it, one of the ways to overcome this barrier, especially on leadership, is to have a leadership that is open-minded and is ready to transform with times, which means because we say everything begins and falls on leadership, it means the individual persons must be open to opportunities to learn new things that even they may move them from what they have already known and embrace something new. We call it learning to unlearn to learn again. Yeah. And so leadership has to be able to unlearn and relearn again so that it can become inclusive leadership. That's the first way to overcome static leadership. The second thing to do is to, of course, improve internal communications within organization. You cannot
Yes.
create inclusive leadership if communication is out of place, which means leaders need to be careful on how they communicate, whatever they communicate with the people they lead. Make sure that you're not double-tongued or multi-tongued. You don't say one thing to one person and report another thing to the other person, because already you're creating dichotomies within the organization and which might lead to cliques. And when you create cliques within the organization as a leader, it means therefore even your own effectiveness as a leader will be stopped by that level of dysfunctionality. The other thing to do to overcome this barrier is to make sure that you clarify roles and responsibility of every person within the organization. I just said that ambiguity in clarifying responsibility and roles can create very difficult environment for people to work together as a team and as a collective. And so leaders are tasked with the responsibility of clarifying roles and responsibility to overcome this barrier that can really hinder inclusive leadership. When people know what each other do, they will even connect without leadership assistance. If I know Brother Dan is good in public speaking, and I am good in facilitating our sessions, I would be able to connect with you directly because we have something in common. We
Yes.
probably have something to do with the public nature of our persona, and therefore, with your skill and my skill, we are able to improve how we deliver our content for this organization to the audiences that we interact with. So when you do not clarify that, one person would think, but why is Paul crossing my path? I'm the facilitator here, but Paul is just a public speaker. Why is he getting into my path? And because of lack of clarifying of responsibilities, two talents that are very much needed in an entity start clashing. And
Yes.
that clash goes a long way in devaluing the value of the service we want to provide to the audiences that we interact with. So it's very, very important that HR processes, human resource processes within an organization are very much streamlined to ensure there is no ambiguity about who does what in the organization. And the fourth thing that I would like to recommend as one way also of overcoming barriers is to become gender inclusive. And in this
Yes.
case, we are living in a world where for decades, we've battled with the issues of patriarchy. We've also dealt with a lot of issues now to do with people of different, orientations. And inclusive leadership recognizes that people are unique, and it does not create further barriers by distinguishing them based on their gender, based on
Yes.
their race, based on their nationality, ethnicity, and the like. And so recognizing that gender is not just an issue of male and female. It's about how we construct roles and responsibility within the organization that make certain people feel left out or excluded because we think certain roles, for example, like in the last week of this conversation, we'll be talking about how does inclusive leadership ensure women empowerment into
Yes.
senior leadership role. So you can create situations within the organization, and without even saying with the words, they are interpreted that certain things can only be done by male colleagues within the team, because of the way you projected whatever task or responsibilities. The task of leadership is to ensure that it's not just about the gender, just the man and the female thing. It's about how we construct the environment to make sure that it's inclusive and that anybody within the entity can be able to take up a responsibility and be respected for the uniqueness that they bring. It doesn't have to be done the way it has been done for centuries. Today is a new day, tomorrow is a new day, and tomorrow can bring in a new, innovative, and creative way of doing the same thing that has been done for centuries in one way with limited results. Again, our powerful mentor, Dr. John Maxwell, says the definition of insanity is doing the same thing, same way, every day, expecting different results. Well, I think that does not need explanation. It's as clear as water that if you do the same thing the same way every day, you cannot expect new results tomorrow. All right. And the last thing I would like to talk about how to overcome the barriers. This one is a bit touchy because of its sensitivity, and that is equality in pay, how you pay people, how you remunerate people.
Yes.
It's an ongoing battle in most organizations because there's always pockets of unhappy people who tend to
Yes.
think they're producing more than other people within the organization and they're not remunerated correctly. And so you cannot create an inclusive environment if there is barriers in people's minds that even the way people are remunerated for their efforts is
Yeah.
either based on where they came from, relationship with the leadership, or education status, of past experiences with the organization. All those things, if they're not properly clarified.
Dr. Paul,
Mhm,
in the interest of time,
mhm.
just in a few words, how then do you deal with that? Because there are a lot of dynamics. There is here you have an organization that maybe doesn't have capacity to really remunerate people well. It's still growing. And then there is that organization that has the capacity, but that still doesn't do that. And then there is this organization that has his priorities upside down, its priority upside down. And so it's a small organization, but it's remunerating people highly to the extent that actually you can predict what's going to happen in the next few years with that kind of an organization. So I don't know, in a few minutes, how do you do that?
Well, first of all, it begins by communicating. If people understand how people are remunerated within the organization, then there is less noise about the disparities. The problem is when people do not know and they're second guessing that people in this organization are paid well because they are close to the leadership of the organization, or they
Yeah.
have links to the to the chairperson of the board and things like that. It becomes very difficult to promote inclusive leadership at that level. Again, the other part, of course, is when the grading scales are not communicated to people. So, for example, if you do not tell, if as a leader of the organization, I do not tell my colleagues that I am privileged to lead, that one way to earn your pay rise is by going back to school, for example, and earning an extra qualification, then it will be very difficult for them to understand if ever by any chance they get to know somebody X who was considered a junior person is now on job grade Y, and nobody knows how this person has actually moved from job group B to job group Y, and there is no tangible evidence of outputs that makes this person to be distinguished. So that ambiguity always in organization makes problems. So the HR policies must be very clear about how people are remunerated. And of course, whilst the salary issues are always the confidential matters between the employer and the employee, but there has to be a way of people knowing the scale They may not know exactly what I'm earning, but they know the scale. So that if people come into the organization with qualification X, they always start at job group certain, and then they work their way up, and then they expect this much. So for me, it's about communication and clarity of HR policies within the organization that make that kind of equitable thinking about pay rise. Of course, people will never be paid the same in any organization, but there has to be clarity about how people get paid so that there is no ambiguity in people's minds.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul. Always a pleasure to have Dr. Paul in the Role Leadership Talk. And I'm sure if you've been following us, you are learning a lot as far as inclusive leadership is concerned. And in this show, we're going to be keeping it real and matters leadership. And one of these fine days, we're going to be discussing also about personal leadership, because sometimes personal leadership hinders you from growing to become the best version of you. And so you wonder why you're being bypassed even in organization, because you are not really provoking yourself also to grow. And so until next time, from the studios of the Africa Center for Public Speaking in connection with Dr. Paul Kariuki, all the way from Durban, South Africa, we want to tell you goodbye and inform your friends. Let's see you next time. I want to leave you with the words of John Quincy Adams, who said, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, and do more, and become more, you are a leader. You are a leader. Thank you very much, and may God bless you.